Hello, I did my presentation on improving adolescent literacy content area strategies at work. The authors of this book are Douglas Fisher and Nancy Frey. Chapter 1 is called Ensuring All Students Read, Write, and Learn. According to a related article, there is a new emphasis in curriculum on how challenging text encourages learning instead of actually impeding it. Before, it was the idea that you shouldn't make students read anything more complex than their grade level, than is at their grade level. But nowadays, they're saying that you need to give your students increasingly complex text in order to exercise their mind and improve their reading. So students will need a variety of strategies in order to figure out how to comprehend these texts, and that's basically what this book is all about. So an important first step in this, according to another related article, is that you need to set a purpose for reading the text. If you don't have your students set a purpose for reading the text, they're not going to know what to look for, and they're not going to follow or understand the text, or their mind is going to be filled with facts that really don't need to be memorized. And this idea of setting a purpose for reading a text is necessary because of the variety of text structures. In science, you have cause and effect text structures. In history, you have a lot of the time journalistic text structures with a main idea and points under certain points to support underneath it. In math, it's problem solution based. Another thing that you should do with your students is make sure they are using metacognitive strategies. Make sure that they are planning out what they are going to read, that they are monitoring themselves, and that they're evaluating how they've done. Metacognitive strategies are necessary for every single reader, and a lot of kids will pick them up and use them themselves, but a lot of kids won't, so these need to be explicitly taught. So this chapter also emphasizes that learning should be done through community. There are several strategies you can use to make sure that to implement learning in a community setting. For example, think pair share, where students read a passage, think about their answers, talk to their neighbor, and then share what they think. Then there is the idea of the jigsaw classroom. The jigsaw classroom involves students who get together and they're each assigned a piece of the text, and then they leave their group, and then they get with a different group that's all reading the same text. They read the text, understand it, and have a specialty return to their group and share what they've learned and create a final piece. So it's learning through community. Chapter 2 is all about anticipatory activities. So anticipatory activities will help students before they read to make connections and build background knowledge. This can help students to maintain information from the text, and it's done before reading. And it's basically anything that you can do to get a student's attention and connect that to the text. Now, this could be using demonstrations or visuals. It could be through dramatics, like a little skit that you put on before you read a text. And it just could be from thought-provoking questions. Chapter 3 was all about vocabulary development, and vocabulary development is really essential because if students don't understand the words in a text, they're not going to understand the text itself. So you really need to, before you try to have students read the text, teach them some of the vocabulary and connect that to the text. And it's good to also connect that to the background knowledge. Don't introduce words out of the context of the text. Make sure that vocabulary words are always connected to a text that you are reading. That's essential that they make these connections. Also, while you're doing that, explain it if there are words that have multiple meanings depending on the text. For example, the word run can be used to mean running a race, or it can mean a run in a stocking. Make sure that students know that some words can be used multiple ways depending on the context, and others, like say magnesium, is a very specialized word that pretty much only has one meaning. A different source article talked about also how teaching prefixes, suffixes, and root words and their definitions are really important for vocabulary development, because this helps students to piece together words they may not have been able to before, even if they don't know that vocabulary word. If they just look at the prefix or the root word or the suffix, they can determine what the word means based on their knowledge of the prefixes and suffixes and such. Chapter 4 is about promoting reading comprehension through read-alouds and shared readings. Reading to your students is so important. It's a form of modeling fluency. It's also important. It also helps to model what an appropriate reader does. It's important that you grab students' attention through some sort of anticipatory activity, that you read aloud to them, and that you stop periodically to ask them questions to demonstrate how a reader thinks when they're reading. And then obviously promote some discussion afterwards on the text, on what you've read. So when you're doing that, you should gradually move into shared readings, which is you read alouds, but they're given a text to follow along with. This follows the I do, we do, you do type of strategy, and eventually they'll be reading on their own. Chapter 5 is all about questioning skills. Questioning is one of the most commonly used strategies amongst teachers, but you need to know what type of questions are best to use. If you need to really focus on the higher order levels of Bloom's taxonomy and ask questions that focus on those areas as well, such as evaluative questions, asking the students to make judgments, analysis questions, asking them to make inferences, synthesis, asking them to questions that will help them to create something of themselves using the information of the text. It's just important that these questions are really deep, quality questions. Chapter 6 was about graphic organizers and how they are so important for students to have visuals. That is so essential for visual learners, and it helps to show them something they might have missed or make a connection they might have missed using just words. So just the arrows and the big boxes and the little boxes showing big ideas and little ideas are so important to the child's development and learning. Chapter 7 was about taking notes and about how that you should encourage note-taking, establish why the students are taking notes so that they'll know how to make them, and make sure you teach them how to paraphrase and how to abbreviate. Know that notes should be made similar to an outline with main ideas and subpoints, and make sure that you provide visuals, give them enough time to make notes. Emphasize important parts in the lecture, and give students just enough time to write down this information. This is so important in the classroom, that you provide an environment where note-taking is encouraged. So chapter 8 was all about writing to learn, which is different from learning to write. And just spelling out ideas is really helpful to students. It will help them to develop their ideas in learning to write. And it will help them to notice connections they might not have before. And some ways to implement this would be through power writing sessions, where you put a prompt on the board and have them write as much as they know about it in a certain period of time. Or through a language experience approach, where students have a discussion and then you decide on a final product, saying or idea, and you write it on the board and they write it themselves, and that's a really good way of doing that. Just any way you can implement writing to learn in your classroom. Chapter 9 was just about assessment and how it shows how we are doing in students' literacy development. There's formal and informal assessment. Formal usually involves a standardized test, and informal is what you do in everyday classroom. Students also need to use literacy strategies for formal assessment, and it's very important that they have the ability to understand how to implement them. It's also important that they know the vocabulary of the text of assessments, such as, words like compare, contrast, synthesize. They should know the vocabulary of a formal assessment tests. So those are just all important areas where we need to target for literacy strategies, and the book is very long, so I tried to summarize it how I could, but that's all for today, folks.